Welcome back. We are in Winter Dreams on page 740, third paragraph into the third chapter that begins at a little after 7. Let's go ahead and see now the first exchange between the two of them.
Chapter 7. Judy Jones came downstairs. She wore a blue silk afternoon dress, and he was disappointed at first that she had not put on something more elaborate. This feeling was accentuated when, after a brief greeting, she went to the door of a butler's pantry and, pushing it open, called, "You can serve dinner, Martha." He had rather expected that a butler would announce dinner, that there would be a cocktail. Then he put these thoughts behind him as they sat down side by side on a lounge and looked at each other. "Father and Mother won't be here," she said thoughtfully. He remembered the last time he had seen her father, and he was glad the parents were not to be here tonight. They might wonder who he was. He had been born in Keble, a Minnesota village 50 miles farther north, and he always gave Keble as his home instead of Black Bear Village. Country towns were well enough to come from if they weren't inconveniently in sight and used as footstools by fashionable lakes. They talked of his university, which she had visited frequently during the past 2 years, and of the nearby city which supplied Sherry Island with its patrons, and whither Dexter would return next day to his prospering laundries. During dinner, she slipped into a moody depression which gave Dexter a feeling of uneasiness. Whatever petulance she uttered in her throaty voice worried him. Whatever she smiled at him, at a chicken liver, at nothing, it disturbed him that her smile could have no root in mirth, or even in amusement. When the scarlet corners of her lips curved down, it was less a smile than an invitation to a kiss. Then, after dinner, she led him out on the dark sun porch and deliberately changed the atmosphere. "Do you mind if I weep a little?" she said. "I'm afraid I'm boring you," he responded quickly. "You're not. I like you. But I've just had a terrible afternoon. There was a man I cared about, and this afternoon he told me out of a clear sky that he was poor as a church mouse. He never even hinted it before. Does this sound horribly mundane?" "Perhaps he was afraid to tell you." "Suppose he was," she answered. "He didn't start right. You see, if I thought of him as poor, well, I've been mad about loads of poor men and fully intended to marry them all. But in this case, I hadn't thought of him that way, and my interest in him wasn't strong enough to survive the shock." As if a girl calmly informed her fiancé that she was a widow. He might not object to widows, but let's start right, she interrupted herself suddenly. "Who are you, anyhow?" For a moment, Dexter hesitated. Then, "I'm nobody," he announced. "My career is largely a matter of futures." "Are you poor?" "No," he said frankly. "I'm probably making more money than any man my age in the Northwest. I know that's an obnoxious remark, but you advised me to start right." There was a pause. Then she smiled, and the corners of her mouth drooped, and an almost imperceptible sway brought her closer to him, looking up into his eyes. A lump rose in Dexter's throat, and he waited breathless for the experiment, facing the unpredictable compound that would form mysteriously from the elements of their lips. Then he saw she communicated her excitement to him, lavishly, deeply, with kisses that were not a promise but a fulfillment. They aroused in him not hunger demanding renewal, but surfeit that would demand more surfeit. Kisses that were like charity, creating want by holding back nothing at all. It did not take him many hours to decide that he had wanted Judy Jones ever since he was a proud, desirous little boy. It began like that, and continued, with varying shades of intensity, on such a note right up to the denouement. Dexter surrendered a part of himself to the most direct and unprincipled personality with which he had ever come in contact. Whatever Judy wanted, she went after with the full pressure of her charm. There was no divergence of method, no jockeying for position or premeditation of effects. There was a very little mental side to any of her affairs. She simply made men conscious to the highest degree of her physical loveliness. Dexter had no desire to change her. Her deficiencies were knit up with a passionate energy that transcended and justified them. When, as Judy's head lay against his shoulder that first night, she whispered, "I don't know what's the matter with me. Last night I thought I was in love with a man, and tonight I think I'm in love with you." It seemed to him a beautiful and romantic thing to say. It was the exquisite excitability that for the moment he controlled and owned. But a week later he was compelled to view this same quality in a different light. She took him in her roadster to a picnic supper, and after supper she disappeared, likewise in her roadster, with another man. Dexter became enormously upset and was scarcely able to be decently civil to the other people present. When she assured him that she had not kissed the other man, he knew she was lying, yet he was glad that she had taken the trouble to lie to him. He was, as he found before the summer ended, one of a varying dozen who circulated about her. Each of them had at one time been favored above all others. About half of them still basked in the solace of occasional sentimental revivals. Whenever one showed signs of dropping out through long neglect, she granted him a brief honeyed hour, which encouraged him to tag along for a year or so longer. Judy made these forays upon the helpless and defeated without malice, indeed half unconscious that there was anything mischievous in what she did. When a new man came to town, everyone dropped out. Dates were automatically canceled. The helpless part of trying to do anything about it was that she did it all herself. She was not a girl who could be won in the kinetic sense. She was proof against cleverness, she was proof against charm. If any of these assailed her too strongly, she would immediately resolve the affair to a physical basis, and under the magic of her physical splendor, the strong as well as the brilliant played her game and not their own. She was entertained only by the gratification of her desires and by the direct exercise of her own charm. Perhaps from so much youthful love, so many youthful lovers, she had come in self-defense to nourish herself wholly from within. Succeeding Dexter's first exhilaration came restlessness and dissatisfaction. The helpless ecstasy of losing himself in her was opiate rather than tonic. It was fortunate for his work during the winter that those moments of ecstasy came infrequently. Early in their acquaintance, it had seemed for a while that there was a deep and spontaneous mutual attraction. That first August, for example, 3 days of long evenings on her dusky veranda, of strange wan kisses through the late afternoon in shadowy alcoves or behind the protecting trellises of the garden arbors, of mornings when she was fresh as a dream and almost shy at meeting him in the clarity of the rising day. There was all the ecstasy of an engagement about it, sharpened by his realization that there was no engagement. It was during those 3 days that, for the first time, he had asked her to marry him. She said, "Maybe someday." She said, "Kiss me." She said, "I'd like to marry you." She said, "I love you." She said, nothing.
One of the things that Fitzgerald is able to do is to create sexual tension in a text without ever really describing the sexuality of the relationship. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm with you on page 742 for just a second. We obviously stopped on page 743. There's a cultural connection here that I just want to point out for you on page 742. Fitzgerald's elusive women. From Daisy, I hope you're reading with me, from Daisy in The Great Gatsby to Judy Jones in Winter Dreams, F. Scott Fitzgerald's fictional landscape is populated by elusive women. In other words, girls that are stunningly beautiful, that guys all want but can never actually seem to get. This theme mirrors Fitzgerald's life, which was deeply bound up in that of his wife, Zelda. When they first met, Zelda Zier was a young Southern society girl, the darling of Montgomery, Alabama. Although Fitzgerald believed himself to be socially inferior to Zelda, he finally won her. The marriage that ensued was troubled and stormy and made more so by Zelda's mental illness. In Fitzgerald's fiction, the lovely, elusive woman becomes not only an object of desire in her own right, but a symbol of all that is desirable in life. And then, of course, you have the picture of Fitzgerald and his girl there on page 742. Let's jump now back to 743. On this note, the summer ended. Of course, we are reminded the title, Winter Dreams, right? Let's pay attention now.
The 3 days were interrupted by the arrival of a New York man who visited at her house for half September. To Dexter's agony, rumor engaged them. The man was the son of the president of a great trust company. But at the end of a month, it was reported that Judy was yawning. At a dance one night, she sat all evening in a motorboat with a local beau, while the New Yorker searched the club for her frantically. She told the local beau that she was bored with her visitor, and 2 days later he left. She was seen with him at the station, and it was reported that he looked very mournful indeed. On this note, the summer ended. Dexter was 24, and he found himself increasingly in a position to do as he wished. He joined 2 clubs in the city and lived at one of them. Though he was by no means an integral part of the stag lines at these clubs, he managed to be on hand at dances where Judy Joos was likely to appear. He could have gone out socially as much as he liked. He was an eligible young man now, and popular with downtown fathers. His confessed devotion to Judy Joos had rather solidified his position, but he had no social aspirations and rather despised the dancing men who were always on tap for the Thursday or Saturday parties, and who filled in at dinners with the younger married set. Already he was playing with the idea of going east to New York. He wanted to take Judy Joos with him. No disillusion as to the world in which she had grown up could cure his illusion as to her desirability. Remember that, for only in the light of it can what he did for her be understood. 18 months after he first met Judy Joos, he became engaged to another girl. Her name was Irene Shearer, and her father was one of the men who had always believed in Dexter. Irene was light-haired and sweet and honorable, and a little stout, and she had 2 suitors whom she pleasantly relinquished when Dexter formally asked her to marry him. Summer, fall, winter, spring, another summer, another fall. So much had he given of his active life to the incorrigible lips of Judy Joos. She had treated him with interest, with encouragement, with malice, with indifference, with contempt. She had inflicted on him the innumerable little slights and indignities possible in such a case, as if in revenge for having ever cared for him at all. She had beckoned him and yawned at him and beckoned him again, and he had responded often with bitterness and narrowed eyes. She had brought him ecstatic happiness and intolerable agony of spirit. She had caused him untold inconvenience and not a little trouble. She had insulted him, and she had ridden over him, and she had played his interest in her against his interest in work, for fun. She had done everything to him except to criticize him. This she had not done. It seemed to him only because it might have sullied the utter indifference she manifested and sincerely felt toward him. When autumn had come and gone again, it occurred to him that he could not have Judy Joos. He had to beat this into his mind, but he convinced himself at last. He lay awake at night for a while and argued it over. He told himself the trouble and pain she had caused him. He enumerated her glaring deficiencies as a wife. Then he said to himself that he loved her. And after a while he fell asleep. For a week, lest he imagine her husky voice over the telephone, or her eyes opposite him at lunch, he worked hard and late, and at night he went to his office and plotted out his years. At the end of a week, he went to a dance and cut in on her once. For almost the first time since they had met, he did not ask her to sit out with him, or tell her that she was lovely. It hurt him that she did not miss these things. That was all. He was not jealous when he saw that there was a new man tonight. He had been hardened against jealousy long before. He stayed late at the dance. He sat for an hour with Irene Shearer and talked about books and about music. He knew very little about either, but he was beginning to be master of his own time now, and he had a rather priggish notion that he, the young and already fabulously successful Dexter Green, should know more about such things. That was in October, when he was 25. In January, Dexter and Irene became engaged. It was to be announced in June, and they were to be married 3 months later. The Minnesota winter prolonged itself interminably, and it was almost May when the winds came soft and the snow ran down into Black Bear Lake at last. For the first time in over a year, Dexter was enjoying a certain tranquility of spirit. Judy Joos had been in Florida, and afterward in Hot Springs, and somewhere she had been engaged, and somewhere she had broken it off. At first, when Dexter had definitely given her up, it had made him sad that people still linked them together and asked for news of her. But when he began to be placed at dinner next to Irene Shearer, people didn't ask him about her anymore. They told him about her. He ceased to be an authority on her. May at last. Dexter walked the streets at night when the darkness was damp as rain, wondering that so soon, with so little done, so much of ecstasy had gone from him. May 1 year back had been marked by Judy's poignant, unforgivable yet forgiven turbulence. It had been one of those rare times when he fancied she had grown to care for him, that old penny's worth of happiness he had spent for this bushel of content. He knew that Irene would be no more than a curtain spread behind him, a hand moving among gleaming teacups, a voice calling to children. Fire and loveliness were gone. The magic of nights and the wonder of the varying hours and seasons. Slender lips down-turning, dropping to his lips, and bearing him up into a heaven of eyes. The thing was deep in him. He was too strong and alive for it to die lightly. In the middle of May, when the weather balanced for a few days on the thin bridge that led to deep summer, he turned in one night at Irene's house. Their engagement was to be announced in a week now. No one would be surprised at it. And tonight they would sit together on the lounge at the University Club and look on for an hour at the dancers. It gave him a sense of solidity to go with her. She was so sturdily popular, so intensely great. He mounted the steps of the brownstone house and stepped inside. "Irene," he called. Mrs. Shearer came out of the living room to meet him. "Dexter," she said, "Irene's gone upstairs with a splitting headache. She wanted to go with you, but I made her go to bed." "Nothing serious, "Oh, no. She's going to play golf with you in the morning. You can spare her for just one night, can't you, Dexter?" Her smile was kind. She and Dexter liked each other. In the living room, he talked for a moment before he said goodnight. Returning to the University Club, where he had rooms, he stood in the doorway for a moment and watched the dancers. He leaned against the doorpost, nodded at a man or two, yawned. "Hello, darling." The familiar voice at his elbow startled him. Judy Joos had left a man and crossed the room to him. Judy Joos, a slender, enameled doll in cloth of gold, gold in a band at her head, gold in 2 slipper points at her dress's hem. The fragile glow of her face seemed to blossom as she smiled at him. A breeze of warmth and light blew through the room. His hands in the pockets of his dinner jacket tightened spasmodically. He was filled with a sudden excitement.
Let's pause for a moment and just take a look now at the sidebar on page 746. Fitzgerald is writing within a time period that we call the Jazz Age. Let's read a few things about it here really quickly. When World War I ended in 1918, Americans were desperate for a good time. They roared into the 1920s at breakneck speed, overthrowing rules about clothing, decorum, and personal style. The flapper, with her short dresses, bobbed hair, and complicated social life, became a symbol of the times. She rode in sporty automobiles and danced until dawn to the sounds of jazz, a new kind of music critics blamed for a loosening moral code. F. Scott Fitzgerald's work and life reflected the gaiety of his time as well as the emptiness many felt when their pleasure-seeking did not prove satisfying. Fitzgerald was not only part of the age, he helped to shape it, naming it the Jazz Age. Through both his life and his fiction, he created some of the decade's most enduring images. And certainly we are about to see this again. This exchange between guy and girl. He's totally into her, but she doesn't ever seem to completely show that she's totally into him. The obvious question is, why doesn't he just let it go? The answer, of course, is not so easy, right? Let's keep reading.
"When did you get back?" he asked casually. "Come here and I'll tell you about it." She turned and he followed her. She had been away. He could have wept at the wonder of her return. She had passed through enchanted streets, doing things that were like provocative music. All mysterious happenings, all fresh and quickening hopes had gone away with her, come back with her now. She turned in the doorway. "Have you a car here? If you haven't, I have." "I have a coupe." In then, with a rustle of golden cloth, he slammed the door. Into so many cars she had